It's great to welcome back to the show today Cal Newport, who's a computer science professor at Georgetown University, author of several books, and most recently, which I just finished, A World Without Email, Reimagining Work in an Age of Communication Overload. Cal, it's always great to have you on.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back.
So in the book, A World Without Email, one of the things you explain is that many jobs, even jobs that don't really have to do with email in terms of what the main impetus of the job is, have become 20, 30, 40, sometimes even more than half managing an inbox, responding to emails in a way that is anywhere from relatively to completely unproductive. You talk about the history of this, and it's really interesting because when email was introduced to office culture, you didn't just have office culture and work culture as it existed with the addition of email. It completely changed the way that work worked, so to speak. Can you talk a little bit about that first?
This is what caught us off guard in the world of work, that when we brought email into our offices, which we did predominantly in the first half of the 1990s, that's when it really spread aggressively through offices. We did so for very narrow pragmatic reasons. We were replacing fax machines, we were replacing voicemail, we were replacing memos. It was like, great, this tool is better at those purposes than the existing technology we were using. Once email actually got into offices, though, it had an unexpected side effect, which is people began using it as the primary means by which they coordinated or collaborated. We introduced a workflow in which everything began to be worked out with back and forth, informal, ad hoc messaging. That didn't scale, and soon we found ourselves overwhelmed with all of the back and forth messages required to support this workflow where everything happens through back and forth messaging. And it's really that workflow, not the tool itself, not the way that it replaced fax machines, not the way it replaced voicemail, but this workflow where we began to work everything out with back and forth messages. That's what created the overload problem that we're all suffering from today.
To some degree, it seems almost like it's become background in this particular sense. My mom also is a college professor, and she's been teaching for decades at this point. And I asked her in preparation for this interview, you know, back like in the 90s, before you were so dependent on email for communication with your department and communication with students and so on, what consumed your day? Because roughly you're working the same amount of time, but now a ton of the time is email. Clearly, the email time now was for something else before. She had no idea. Like, in other words, it's sort of crept in such a way where she agrees, I work roughly the same amount. I didn't used to do the email thing. Now I do. I don't remember what I did before. Is that surprising to you, or does that make sense?
Well, I think we should not underestimate the degree to which this workflow, in which now we have to attend these inboxes all day, is really actually putting its hand down firmly on economic growth. And looking at a college professor is it's a good bottle case study, because it's a job that has been basically the same for 200 years. And in my book, I talked about my grandfather was the great example, a very successful professor, endowed chair at Rice University that went on to be the provost of a theological seminary, incredibly productive, such an effective teacher that even to this day, I still hear from his former students, he had such a big impact on his life. He never owned a computer until after he retired. And I'm thinking his objectives were no different than my objectives as a professor today, to do research and to teach well. And he had no email. And yet today we'll spend, like your mom was talking about, 50 to 60% of our time on email. It's a real issue. So what is getting squeezed out here? I think productive output. I think the reason why non-industrial productivity metrics have been stagnant for decades, even as we put all this innovation into very rapid, low friction communication and computation technology, is because we are moving more and more of our time into just tending this communication. And I think what we have to do to compensate for that is we're adding extra work off the books. We're working early in the morning. We're working in the evening. Like we're basically trying to just keep productivity stable by adding a lot more hours into the mix. It's a huge issue, and it's one I think we're ignoring.
One approach to the issue, and some of your past writing has sort of dealt with this, and there's many other people who write about this, is about techniques and strategies. Train others to expect that you check email once a day, or at the beginning, at the end, or 3 times a week, or whatever, and over time, that's going to help everybody. Or Write your emails in a way where you are providing the other person everything they need to complete the task rather than communicating the minimum, which then creates a back and forth over a week for something that a 5-minute phone call might be able to fix. That's one approach, like the very nitty gritty logistical approach. That doesn't seem to me like it really gets at the bigger picture issue. What do you think, that we need to be tackling both the big picture and the nitty gritty, or could the nitty gritty really solve a lot of the problem?
The nitty gritty alone is not going to solve the problem. And this is why I think we're stuck, is we've been trying to solve the issue of email overload in the inbox itself. Oh, spend less time checking emails, batch your emails, have better subject lines, right? Have better norms, have better expectations. But we can't solve this problem. This is one of the sort of the big idea of the new book, is we can't solve this problem just in the inbox. The issue is the underlying workflows. So long as implicitly the way that your organization collaborates is through ad hoc back and forth unscheduled messages, the demand to keep up with all of these back and forth threads demands that you check your inbox all the time, because that is how your work is actually happening. This is why when we don't change that underlying workflow, but just say have better habits when you personally interact with your inbox, that fails. So my big push now is to get past this moment we're in, which we're extremely subduing our productivity because of all the constant context shifting and communication. We have to fix the underlying workflows. That is the rules and the guidelines and the agreements we have about how collaboration happens. It can't just be rock and roll in email, rock and roll in Slack, rock and roll in Teams. We'll just figure it out. That does not work. It is a bad way to build the metaphorical cars, if you know what I mean. And so we have to fix this at that level before the messages get into the inbox in the first place.
In the book, you talk about fixing it within an organization in terms of the communication with coworkers. And it's sort of different, at least, than fixing it when it comes to people you interface outside of your organization. Like, for example, consultants working with clients, which you include examples of in the book. Does it make sense to first fix it internally before doing it externally?
Both of these can happen in parallel. It doesn't quite matter. What really matters is having that mindset shift, which is saying, okay, our work is made up of processes. We might not call it that, but that's what they are. They're things we do on a regular basis that produce the value for our team, our organization, our company. Okay, how are we implementing these processes? How do we get the information? Where do we store the information? How do we communicate with each other to actually accomplish these processes? What are our rules for that? And if you don't have rules written down, the default answer is probably this hyperactive hive mind approach of we'll just work it out on the fly. Once you have that mindset, yeah, you're going to see there's client communication processes. Let's make those better. There are internal processes. How do we schedule meetings? How do we agree on new copy for ads? You fix those processes. But the big step here is that mindset shift, that even in knowledge work, there's things you do again and again. And either you have rules about how you want to collaborate to accomplish those things, or you don't. And if you don't, you're probably leaving a huge amount of productivity on the table.
One of the things you talk about in the book is that when people in the knowledge work space are presented with this idea, almost invariably, they react by saying, okay, yeah, that might work in industries A, B, C, and D, but I'm in a more unique position in my particular job, in my particular field, with my particular company. This really wouldn't work. And that belief seems to be very prevalent. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the types of changes that probably would work in just about any knowledge work field?
Well, I think one of the problems here is that when people think about reforming email, they think about, okay, what if nothing changed about the underlying workflow? When they're imagining it, they're imagining their work as it happens right now in their organization, where most things are figured out with back and forth messaging.
Right.
And then they say, in that context, if I stopped using email as much, bad things would happen. And they're right. If your organization or team uses this hyperactive hive mind workflow, it would be a problem if you stopped using it. So getting people to look below the inbox and say, no, we want to fix how you collaborate in the first place so that those messages don't show up in your inbox, that you're not figuring things out with unscheduled messages, and we get down to the roots of it. So what do those changes look like? It depends on the process, right? So this is why it's not a tool discussion. It's a non sequitorious question to say, well, if not email, then what tool? Completely, it's not the question. The question is, okay, if not this hyperactive hive mind workflow, how else should we collaborate or communicate? It depends on what you're doing. So sometimes these solutions are simple plug-in technology fixes. If you have to schedule a bunch of meetings, you should absolutely be using a meeting scheduling tool. Having to go back and forth emails to find a time to meet is surprisingly cognitively taxing. Fine. Sometimes what you're talking about is a process that's very rigorously defined. It's the same steps, one after another. This is what we do to produce our podcast episode every week. It's 7 steps, one follows the others. Those can often be automated in such a way that no one has to send unscheduled messages back and forth. The stuff moves from place to place. People see it without having to do unscheduled messaging. And sometimes these fixes are about making information and collaboration more structured. So all of the information for this project is on a shared task board that we can all look at. We have highly structured status meetings that are 15 minutes long, where it's what were you working on last time? How did it go? What are you working on today? What do you need to get that done? Great. We'll talk again tomorrow. So very structured check-ins, very structured ways of storing the information. That's sort of the third category of what these process overhauls look like. So the particular tools or rules or guides depends on what's the specific process that you're overhauling. But the thing that unifies this all is looking at all the processes in your work life and saying, how do we reduce all of this back and forth unscheduled messaging for each of them?
You know, one of the things I was thinking of as I read the book was that there's a sort of maybe parallel issue or question here, which is one that's been written about a lot in the last 5 to 7 years, of attention span. And there are very differing views on this issue. I think I've read a lot of Nir Eyal's work where he says he doesn't think that fundamentally there is an attention span issue, but that the issues are something different. And there's others who say, no, you know, the mobile phones and the email and all of these things have conditioned people in some way to for it to be more and more difficult to spend longer periods of time focused on one thing. Is there some way in which this entire email thing of 30, 40, 50% of your day is dipping in and out of answering emails quickly to get breaks from the more serious work, maybe connected less to systems, but to this attention span issue?
Yeah, it's an important question because I see a clear separation between what's happening, let's say, with our phones, the attention span issue with social media, online news, wanting to continually go back to my phone and be distracted.
Yeah.
Where you have tools that are engineered that try to distract you. I see that as very separate from what's happening with us having to check email all the time.
Okay.
Now, it has been common to look at email through the lens of a sort of personal addiction, for example. When the hyperactive hive mind workflow first took off in the 2000s, we introduced terminology like crackberries to refer to people checking their BlackBerries all the time. Mm-hmm. But I'm convinced, based on my research, that the reason we're checking email all the time, it's not a failure of personal will. It is not an escape from work that is difficult. It is because the underlying workflow, what I call the hyperactive hive mind, demands it. If most of the way that things get worked out or collaboration occurs in your organization is with unscheduled back and forth messages, there is no other way to successfully interface with your organization than to constantly be checking those inboxes, because that's what you need to do to keep knocking these metaphorical tennis balls back across the net, to keep these ongoing asynchronous ad hoc conversations going. So when it comes to email, I don't think the issue is that people have bad habits. I think the issue is that organizations are running in nonsensical ways.
Last thing I want to touch on, you talk in the book about how many of the tasks that are now distributed throughout the day for a knowledge worker or professional of different kinds, at some previous point might have been handled by either an assistant, secretary, or a position that now is essentially no longer needed. To me, that seems like a huge cost reduction for many companies. Is that an economic reality that will resist the types of changes you're talking about because it is so much less expensive? Or is the counter that the lost productivity, because a lot of these professionals are doing these things throughout the day, essentially outweighs the cost savings of not having the assistant or the secretary?
I think the latter is true. I mean, there are some studies that actually quantify this. One of the studies I talk about in the book was watching the arrival of personal computers in a collection of Fortune 500 companies. Mm-hmm. And what they saw and what they observed in this research is that, yes, they fired a lot of the support staff because technically the computer made it easy enough to do a lot of the things that the support staff was doing that the frontline executives could do it themselves. But this researcher, he actually tracked the numbers and found out that they ended up having to hire more of the much higher paid executives to get the same amount of work done, because so much of their day now was spent doing things like word processors and communication, et cetera, that the salary cost went up. So they saved salary costs by firing support staff, but then increased salary costs by having to hire more people to get the same amount of work done. And they ended up worse off because these salaries were higher. I think we missed the mark on the digital productivity revolution. As technology made certain administrative tasks easier, the right move was not to move all of that work onto the plate of the executives or frontline value producers. It should have been to make it cheaper to have support staff. I think the right application of that technology would be, oh, fewer support staff can now support more of the frontline workers. That was probably the right way to approach the productivity revolution in terms of maximizing return. Instead, we said, let's fire the support workers and make everyone a part-time administrative assistant and a part-time whatever their main job is. We know the way the brain works, that was a bad mix. So I think we really missed the mark on this digital productivity revolution. It does make us much more productive if we use that to actually empower support staff to be even more effective, not to put more things on the plate of the people that you wanted thinking about the ad copy or making the executive decisions or writing the academic papers or whatever it is you had hired them to do.
Right. That it's a fascinating book. The book is A World Without Email, Reimagining Work in an Age of Communication Overload. You know, I find that so often when I talk to people about this book, other books you've written, and there's this visceral reaction like, that would never work. We shouldn't even be thinking about that. Do you see, is that a common reaction from a lot of people?
Well, I think the key thing with this book is understanding that you're changing the workflow, because as soon as you say just you need to spend less time on email, they're
Right.
so overwhelmed by this hyperactive hive mind workflow. They're like, are you kidding me? I would be dead because everything is happening in the inbox. But the real aha moment for most people is when you say, yeah, the reason why that's happening is because the underlying agreements by how work happens is generating all these messages, and it doesn't have to be that way. And you tell them about companies where they don't use email and they don't use Slack and they don't have an inbox to check and they do one thing at a time and maybe they work on 3 things each day. And when you show them those stories, you can just see the light turn on behind their eyes. So I think that's key. The way we work today makes it impossible not to check email. I agree. We can fix the underlying way we work, though.
We've been speaking with Cal Newport, computer science professor at Georgetown University. We'll link to the latest book, A World Without Email. Cal, always great having you on.
Thanks, David.